In the hybrid working environment, I think they need to check in on people rather than check on people. What they have reported back to me is that management has been largely absent in many cases. And when they are present online, it's much more of a checking on employees rather than concern for their well-being.
Innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. Steve Jobs. Today, however, we're talking to Professor Patrick Flood of Dublin City University, or otherwise known as DCU, all the way in Ireland. He had his first publications in the late 1980s and has since become a leader in his field of organizational behavior. Not only is he widely lauded for his work on CEOs and HR and how that affects the performance of organizations, he was also my professor during my MBA, and he gave me the love for the human in human resources and the humanity of leadership teams. In this, our conversation, we talk about remote working, something that's now become commonplace after COVID had hit and all of us had been in lockdown. But how will that affect us into the future? We often say that within teams, especially creative teams, we need the diversity and the connection. But are these performance increases we see, however, now, since COVID hit, really true for every industry? Or is it only for certain individuals? And what happens at the team level? That's some of the things we discuss. And one of the problems he brings up is trust. How do you trust and how do you bond with a team in a virtual world? We try and look at the problem around fairness and interpersonal networking in this virtual, connected but also disconnected world. One of those dilemmas we talk about is the vulnerability of leaders. How do I show authenticity and vulnerability in a virtual world? And we then end by discussing about what the effects could be of bad management. How exponentially bad does it become in the virtual world? And what kind of stresses are we adding to teams, and how do we deal with those? Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Patrick. What would you say is currently our biggest challenges as leaders?
I think the crisis at the moment, the pandemic crisis, is probably right up there in terms of coping with, dealing with, and adjusting to. I think it has had fundamental impact on the way we work, on the way we learn, and I think it has a fundamental impact on the culture of the organization. At one time, people were pretty used to operating in a corporate setting, 300, 400, maybe thousands of people in a single building or a set of buildings. But now it's a situation where people are working from home, they're coming in periodically. My sense is that the culture has to be more fragmented than it might have been. And I don't think we know the answers to those questions yet, until some studies are done. But my sense is that the notion of having a very communal organization is probably going to elude us in the new environment.
Do you think that'll change, though? Because if you look at some of the new tools that Microsoft's bringing out about what they call strong and weak tie contacts, they're looking at how people interact, and they've got something called nudges, which is within a new tool called Viva, where they will remind a manager that he hasn't had contact or a one-to-one or a conversation with someone recently. Do you think those kind of things will help?
I think they can help. I think there's a generational gap around their usage as well. Younger workers who are more used to being online digitally for longer periods of time. I think, they probably will adapt to that very quickly. But when I get nudges too, such as you haven't replied to this email and so on, and I have to tell you, it doesn't have any influence on me at all.
What I also find interesting is that I just listened to a podcast this earlier today, that they basically recording everything in Microsoft. So they're recording the meetings as well, and those get indexed and translated.
Wow.
So you create a body of knowledge within the organization that's completely searchable. What do you think that will do to our cultures if we're that open and transparent?
It is interesting. Microsoft has a good reputation as an open and fairly transparent culture, but so it may well work there. I'm not sure. However, there's a lot of organizations where it's not psychologically safe to speak up or to give your opinions. And all I can see in that environment is that it would close people down further. So I think the real core element there is trust, and whether people really trust that they are safe in speaking up, saying things fairly directly to their superiors, speaking truth to power. In the absence of that level of trust or psychological safety, then I think it'd be very difficult, So. And my experience is that those organizations vary a huge amount in terms of their trust levels. Really good ones, very very trustworthy environments. People speak up and they're not afraid to speak. But in the ones where they have reservations about their leaders, in the ones where they have reservations about the difference between what their leaders say and what their leaders do, I don't see it working.
Do you think there's something we need to be teaching in business schools around this, about this remote working, and what can we do about that?
Yep, that is a big challenge. I know in my own university, at Dublin City University, we have a virtual lab now where people can go in and experience virtual reality, and so I think we need to open people's minds to that. But people have this sense that that is the future and that's the way everybody's going to work and so on. For some high-tech organizations, that's going to be very relevant, but for a lot of people, it's not.
I can imagine, like with manufacturing and stuff like that, it might be more difficult because the location is important. But I had a discussion with someone about the metaverse, Mark Raymond, and we were just talking about identity, sort of what is identity. Recently, racial identity has been something that's been in the news, and we've talked about gender identity and gender expression. And if a metaverse, if we can start with these virtual labs, if we start expressing identity, as Mark likes to call it, am I a flying purple centaur? What does that identity look like? And what kind of place does that have in the workplace? Do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, I guess I would look at that in terms of things like authenticity, we know who we are in a kind of a grounded reality. At least we should know who we are. Often project we're somebody else. And then you take that up several levels and up to the virtual world, and you're moving up a kind of a ladder of abstraction, I think, from reality to an imaginary world. And do I particularly like to interact with people who aren't authentic and who are imaginary? Not particularly, especially if I have to do business and if there's money involved.
I think when we look at the gaming environment, we tend to see people cooperating in different ways. In the business environment, there's still a lot of sort of, let's look at your facial expressions and let's look at your body language. But in the gaming environment, you can't really see that. You see the avatar running about and it's got no expressions. What do you think will be the new ways that leaders might need to modify the behavior or change to allow for this hybrid working environment?
In the hybrid working environment, I think they need to check in on people rather than check on people. And certainly, I've supervised some projects over the last few months of people doing, dissertations and consulting projects and so on. And what they have reported back to me is that management has been largely absent in many cases. And when they are present online, it's much more of a checking on employees rather than concern for their well-being. So that has appeared in a number of projects, I'd have to say. So that's a concern. Now throw in a few avatars and people running around the place, and you've got a recipe, but it's not a recipe for reality.
Mm.
Mm.
I think it's also recently there's been some interesting statistics coming out that seems like this performance increases.
Yes. Yep, that is true.
And I was wondering, have you read any of the studies, or do you know anything about that?
I can't cite chapter and verse on these studies, but I have seen them, and I think productivity in general seems to have increased in a lot of industries by the fact that people are working at home, that they have gained maybe 1, 2, sometimes 3 hours of their commuting time, which leaves you with a 5-hour day rather than an 8-hour day. So there's a time gain there when you can be productive. And I think provided you have your home set up so that you're not continuously interrupted by a stream of young kids or whatever, which of course is the norm in a lot of people's houses, then you can be very effective. And the other part of the productivity, though, as well, is that people are probably working longer hours, I think, and probably uh, a little bit scared to say, well, this is outside my working hours, because they're conscious that the work employment situation is a bit attenuated in many companies.
I just wondered as well if productivity is up. When we talked, when I was one of your students, we also talked about things like performance management systems and how do we measure stuff. And for me, if we measure people at the individual level, and productivity is measured at the individual level, and we say things like innovation and creativity and real exponential value is in the team level.
Yeah.
It just seems weird that the results are saying at the individual level, which I assume it is up, but nobody's talking about the cohesion, the loyalty, the exponential part, the team part. Have you seen anything around that? And what are your thoughts about that?
No, I think you put your finger on an area that needs to be much more studied. I have no doubt that somebody somewhere is working on this, and probably more than one research team is working on it. But I haven't seen it appear in the literature yet. But you are right, because you need exchange and combination to take place for innovation to flourish. Now, there are a lot of, as you know very well, better than I, there are lots of digital tools that you can use to allow people to, work on simultaneously on Jamboards and different things and exchange ideas. And you can facilitate that, but it's not quite the same effect that where you have people side by side, because there's a kind of a chemistry thing goes on, I think, when you have people working together, and one sparks off the other, and suddenly someone runs up to the board and writes something down, and the other person reacts. So you can simulate that, I think, using technology, but I don't think you can do it. You certainly can't do it as well.
Because if we also look at people's coping mechanisms and triggers, there's some people that really work well in groups and that need it and feel connected and more valued when they do, and others that want to work in an environment, so sort of leave me alone, let me get down and do things. And so there's some of the studies or some of the statistics, and again, this Microsoft thing that I listened to is, or actually an HBR or Harvard Business Review, their YouTube channel. They talk about 75% of people getting more done, 75% people wanting to work together more, 75% of people, you go like, how many 75% can you have? And are they the same people? Because it just sounds like it is. How can everybody like doing everything? It doesn't make sense. So I was just wondering, are we seeing a disconnect by looking at the averages?
You may well be, because the average does disguise a lot, and especially if you're looking at it from a normal distribution point of view, well, you've got two tails. You've got the exceptionally happy campers, and then you've got the exceptionally unhappy campers, and then you've got the medium happy campers all in the middle, which probably makes up your 75%. But there've always been cases, I think, where you have workers who just don't fit in, or perhaps even they are on the spectrum slightly, and they do their best work on their own. And if you go into the software industry, you will always find people like that. They're often the best and the brightest, but they're better off working on projects on their own. So I think that phenomenon is fairly well known, but I haven't seen any studies that have looked on at the team level.
I was wondering if we think that leaders that are more engaged, or leaders that are more present, and checking in instead of checking out and monitoring, or looking for ways to critique, might be better in these kind of environments. I was wondering, do you have any ideas as to what people could do? So if we were to have advice for leaders, what would that be?
Well, I think you still, and probably especially so, need to create social bonds amongst workers who are operating in a virtual world, but also a fragmented world. I have a nephew. He's a sales director with a large multinational, and it's a US company. And he tells me that that he didn't get into his new office because he changed jobs for 2 years. But, every few weeks there was some sort of a social event. And he said, packages would arrive at the doorstep, hampers and all sorts of different things. And they would actually, virtually meet and socialize. And it wasn't about work. And that seemed to be effective in creating bonds. So, I think you need to look after that side of things anyway. And especially if you want people to trust each other. The trust levels in the online world are naturally lower than when you meet people face to face, because you've got a whole set of sensory cues that are telling you, I like this person. Generally, if you like someone, you tend to trust them, and then apparently we assess people on the basis of two criteria. The first one is, do we like them? Right? And that's a proxy for trust usually. And the second one is, are they competent? Can they do the job? But what we also do know from studies that have been done of teams, and indeed in the Navy SEALs and so on, is that people tend to prefer, if they have the choice between a competent jerk, right, someone who is extremely able, but you wouldn't turn your back on them, versus someone who is medium competence, but you could trust them with your life, they will choose the latter. So I think it is very relevant. So as a general point, I would say, because trust is lower in those environments, you need to work at it more.
What can we do to work on trust?
Most people divide trust into 3 different levels. Competence-based trust. I trust that you know your stuff and you can do your job. The second one is integrity-based trust, which is that I think you're probably fairly honest, and you operate according to an acceptable set of business principles. And then the third one is benevolence-based trust. And benevolence-based trust means, I can turn my back on you, and I can leave the boardroom table when there's a discussion about the resources being carved up, and somebody will say, well, we better wait until Peter comes back here before we settle any of that, you know. Now, my experience, I've did a lot of research at one time in the software industry, and you know, startups and, you know, fast growing companies and so on. And my experience was like, you know, benevolence-based trust was like 20%, if it was 20% amongst most of the groups. So they were able to function, you know, but they weren't really high-performing groups. And, you know, so the extent to which I think altruistic behavior is shown and demonstrated by leaders to their people, it tends to set a tone for the team. In the absence of it, you'll get by, you know, on a kind of very transactional sense. But will you get a lot of innovation? Will you get a lot of people kind of, you know, who know the new opportunities that exist, but will they share them with the company? That's another matter. And if there's a sense of benevolence around, yes, they will. If there isn't, no, they won't.
I'm wondering if you don't have the experience of creating an environment where you show benevolence or where you show compassion, and I mean you're a first time manager or in your mid-20s or something, where your first managerial job. What can they do to, sort of, from a practical perspective, to improve that the perception of benevolence?
Something probably worth saying in advance is that young managers tend to adopt and learn their own managerial behaviors from the person they report to early on in their life. And it may take years for them to realize that was a chronic role model to use. So type of things is giving support to people, helping people in their job, coaching them, telling them about opportunities, asking people how they are over a cup of coffee. Those type of activities, I think, have a good impact.
This interview Microsoft said, the CEO of Microsoft basically said that they have adopted a new way to help their leaders think about what they need to do. It's sort of a new leadership program or policy, and that is model, coach, care. And so model behavior, coach people on competencies and skills, and then care, show that you care. I assume that's that benevolent side you're referring to. So if we have that care element for young managers, what would be the practical things they can do every day? Let's make one or two tips to say, well, if you do this, at least it'll go in the right direction.
I would say take time to just do very simple things like saying hello and having, you know, a 1 minute conversation with somebody can make a big difference. Employees often, because they're so attuned to the behaviors and moods of their managers, much more so than managers ever realize, you know. So if a manager walks by you and, you know, ignores you, you know, people are scratching their head and think, what did I do? You know, this must be about something, you know, and it could be about nothing. It could be just that the manager is preoccupied, right? So to be aware of those things and to make sure that they connect with people, you know, early in the day, I would say, where there's a natural break to ask people how they were, you know, and even randomly to do things like having cups of coffee with different people. All of that creates the sentiment that, you know, the manager is present, the manager behaves in a way which is admirable, and the manager actually is concerned about me as a person as well, you know. And there's a massive increase at the moment in the literature of leadership, on compassionate leadership, you know. And that's it, you know, because people do burn out, you know. Being aware that the demands that they're making on people can burn people out, and, you know, restraining themselves, maybe from over delegating, for example, or giving people impossible requests to have done overnight, and, you know, knowing that the employee is going to have to stay up all night to finish them. Now, that happens, and of course it's necessary sometimes. but sometimes it's not. So exercising some self-restraint and some self-management uh, generally will make them a better manager. So I'd say, simple things like that.
One of the other things I recently read was about
Mm,
fairness and perceived fairness. And what do you think is the best way of showing that in a virtual world
mm,
or in
mm,
a
mm.
hybrid
Yeah,
world?
that is an interesting question. And actually, together with a colleague of mine, Dr. Nafu at Trinity College Dublin, we wrote a paper a couple of years ago on this issue of perceived fairness in teams. And the manager who's a team lead, has to balance two things. One is they have to be transparently fair with everybody in the team. Otherwise, people get irked. But at the same time, there are people in the team who do more, contribute more, put more effort in, and you have to recognize that as well. So we call it paradox management, where you have to ensure that everybody has treated fairly, but that meritocracy is also rewarded. And so, in a practical sense, how would you actually do that? One way to do that is obviously treating the team fairly, but then when development opportunities come up, you make them available to everybody, but they have to compete for them. And that's your mechanism to allow reward for the people who are doing more, contributing more. You know, so it's an interesting it's an interesting process, and it's like walking a tightrope. But if you talk to anyone who's the team lead, uh, they have to do both.
I think Kim Scott, she worked at Apple and Google, if I remember correctly. She wrote something interesting in one of her books, and about time being a way
Yes,
of basically creating perceived fairness. So give everybody the same amount of time.
yes,
And then I think Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen in the book about feedback and difficult conversations wrote something interesting, which is about a story of an American president. Um, I think it was Nixon that had this little floppy-eared dog that bounced around the Oval Office. I don't know if you know, the carpet in the Oval Office is rewoven every 4 years. They get a brand new carpet in there, and it's
that's
sort of
probably
like
in response to the new dog.
probably. And so I don't know who was his security
Mm,
advisor, but he was sitting there, and the dog started sort of picking at the little gold thread in the carpet,
mm, mm,
And if you're going to get a foreign dignitary, you don't want this sort of frayed carpet showing up.
mm,
So he would grab this handful of dog biscuits and throw it at the dog, person go like, stop that, all right? Till his security advisor at one point told him, Mr. President, I would just like to point out that is the reason why things are not going so well in the Middle East. I guess, like, what do you mean? He says, because we're rewarding bad behavior. And and so
Brilliant.
it's always stuck with
Mm,
me. If we have in a leadership
mm,
position for those people that struggle,
yeah.
if we're going to use time as a fairness
Mhm,
element, we should not give time from the leader, the manager, to those people that are underperforming, but get them the help they need, either through coaching or mentoring or something like that. So we do not disturb the fairness
mm,
principle.
mm.
What do you think of that?
Yes, I mean I can see exactly the argument you're making, and the only trouble with it, right, is that um, you're kind of writing off the people who are at the bottom end of the distribution, and saying, well, they're never going to come up to par. Um, so therefore, why should I be investing time in them? Uh, so I think the Jack Welch rule, um, when he was running General Electric, and when he was very popular in the business press, was that you basically gave people two or three goes. The first one was, if the person is incompetent, well, then train them. Then improve their training, get them up to a performance level. And if it still isn't working by the third time, well, it's time to say goodbye. So I think as long as you give some opportunity to those people, then I think what you're saying could work. But you'd have to do that first.
Yes, of course. I think that's just for me giving time to every single person in the team that I lead. For instance, I give everybody the same amount of time, but what we do with that time is different because each individual's needs are different. And so we try and figure out what are the needs currently and how does that pertain to your work and what you need to do. And we try and make sure that you have all the right tools and the right skills. And I might not be the person to teach you that. We'll get you the right person in to do that.
Makes sense.
And so that has sort of also become a reward system in that I think what you were saying earlier is that what leaders tend to not understand is the disproportionate impact of what we say and what we do have on people that report into us. And saying something like, I'll make time for you. Time is one of the most precious resources there are. And I think that shows that we care.
Yeah.
So when it comes to networking and the power of networks, how do you think that is changing within this digital and virtual environment?
Well, I've always thought that networks were very important, I would be what I would describe as an accidental networker, right? In that I don't seek to build my network. But after teaching and different encounters or whatever, small number of people, generally asked to connect with me. So it's kind of accidental. But and as you said earlier, you need to have these weak ties and you need to have these strong ties. Strong ties, people you've known for a long time, trust them, and so on. But there can be a sameness to that. They can be very like you, and therefore you trust them a lot. And then you have people who just pop into your network for one reason or another, and as a result, they can give you an opportunity or an innovation or something that the other people can't do. So I always say to people, you've got to have weak ties and strong ties in your network. Then you come to the virtual environment. I've 7,800 people on my LinkedIn network right now. I know that compared to some of my colleagues who've got 100,000 is very minor, but it's also reasonably large compared to a lot of my other colleagues, right? Now, do I know everybody there? No, I don't. And if you follow Rob Cross, the network guru at Babson College, he says, cut it off at 150 because 150 is manageable. Well, I passed that stage a long, long time ago. So there's a lot of people on that network, maybe there's about 40, 50% I do not know. But there's an awful lot of people there I do know. And sometimes, very occasionally, right, I find that a weak contact is the person who can help me do something. I generally don't ask for personal help, but I will ask for other people. If I think there's a useful connection, if I don't think it's too onerous to ask the favor for the person, because I'm generally asking someone who I've done something for, but I'm asking on behalf now of somebody else. And people are pretty good, actually. And the truth is that if you ask for help, a lot of people, a surprising amount of people, aren't asked. And when they are asked, they tend to be positive. In the virtual world, would you do? I'm not on Facebook, but would you regard all of your Facebook contacts as strong contacts? Probably not. So there's a lot of networking that used to take place at conferencing, face-to-face meetings, and so on. Those things are going to return, but they're not going to return in the same volume as previously. So you'll see that type of networking. And for the people if you want to just network with people who you have met online, why not? But would I feel comfortable? Would I have a sense of assurance about those people? probably not, you know. So it's a very personal thing, and you know, I think, but I do encourage people to build up their networks. You know?
I think I'm thinking at a work environment as well. You know, if you're working in a large corporate environment, you tend to also build your own network within that environment. And some of it start off with weak ties where you basically meet each other at the
Yeah.
coffee machine and accidentally have a conversation, or what used to be in vogue in the old days, have a smoke together outside, you know, and in wind and rain, and commiserate that you're wet. Um, how do we build those kind of environments where people can connect if our world is hybrid or virtual?
I think you have to have days that are shared in the corporate environment. You know, so you can say, look, you work at home. You can work at home 3 days a week or 4 days a week, but everybody's on site 1 day a week. You know, and then you can give some sense of continuity to that type of internal networking, or having events which attract people. You know, so for example, a masterclass series, you know, where you have the great and the good presenting, that'll attract people. So you have to have things, I think, that are naturally interesting to people to get them on site, and you know, just having some core working rules, I think, is a way to do it.
What would you recommend virtual teams do?
Virtual teams. Yeah, I think we kind of touched on that earlier, and I think you know, the teams need to have some social aspects as well. Let me give you an example of a company I know, and they're in the probate law business, you know, and they do genealogy searches and so on. And they have, you know, every 3 or 4 weeks they have they play games, right, for a couple of hours. You know, I can't remember the details of it, but it's bingo. Bingo is what they play. You know, so they play a virtual bingo. You know, and it seems to have the atmosphere. You know, so I think you can be pretty imaginative, but you do need to set some time aside for those type of events. You know.
I think it's in COVID we saw a lot of those examples as well, with families cooking together, but with the mobile phone sort of hanging skew off a cupboard somewhere or taped to it, and so Granny can participate and everybody else can have a cock, you know. And I mean, I've done it with my own
Yeah,
mum, you know,
yeah.
sort of tape the mobile phone to the side of a cupboard in the kitchen, and my other half was cooking,
Mm-hmm.
and I was giving a running commentary about what I'm smelling and what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing,
Mm-hmm.
so my mum could cook along, and we all had the same ingredients. And
Very good.
another thing, what we did for the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Home Affairs here in the Netherlands, is we did a roadshow event for
Mm-hmm.
them. And one of the things we did is we got a celebrity chef, or basically patissier,
Mm-hmm.
of YouTube in, and he taught everybody how to make chocolates with their families.
Yeah.
So they got the whole family
Mm-hmm.
in as well, and everybody got a mold sent at home, which had the logo, and then everybody got some chocolate sent as well, and then they just had to get a glass bowl and put it on a metal one with some water in it and create a bain marie and make their own chocolate, or temper their own chocolate. So it was quite fun, messy, and great to see people's social interactions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that does mean that the people at the office didn't interact with each other other than virtual. It was the local family
Yeah,
environment
yes.
that made it a little bit more special.
Yeah, sure. It's a bit like hybrid teaching, you know. The people who are in the classroom in the presence of the teacher have a different and probably a much more intimate experience with the class teacher than the people who are online listening in, you know. And you notice that as well when you ask questions, you know. It's the people in the classroom who do most of the answering, and a minority of people online will jump in, you know. So you have to work at that.
I think one of the things that on the teaching side that I find interesting is I belong in a few of these WhatsApp mastermind kind of groups
Mm.
where we discuss this kind of stuff. Is the amount of breakout room use
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
or collaborative tool use to break up
Yeah,
the teaching methodology,
yeah,
so you can bring a bit of theory but get people to actually do
yeah.
stuff. And more the practical side. I think that's something at the universities we tend to do a lot more theory
Mm.
and then go and think about it and write about
Mhm.
it. And the colleges tend to be a little bit more practical.
Mm.
And it seems like in business, there's a hankering for the
Yeah,
practical.
absolutely, absolutely. In my own teaching, I would use certainly when I'm doing online teaching, I would use polling and Vivox and virtual, the breakout rooms, uh, throughout the session. Yeah, because you got to do that. You got to. It's kind of you're saying, okay, well, and maybe this is wrong, but you say, well, what was the ideal environment before all of this happened, and how can we recreate that environment as much as possible online? So those are good tools.
I've also started becoming a little bit weird, and that if I wasn't weird enough already, so I'm a bit of a Trekkie. So now when I put people in breakout rooms, I go like, just need to check with the technical department. Is Scotty, are you available? Scotty, can you beam us up? And then I play this transporter sound when the when the breakout room's
Very
open,
good.
or
I need that.
Michael, can we open the gates of heaven for a second? We need some breakout rooms, and then Prem handle something like Hallelujah or
Mm,
something like
mm,
that. Just to break out and make it a little bit more fun to engage with.
absolutely.
Do you think that has a role to play in leadership, having fun or a laugh?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you look at all of the great cultures in various companies, one of the things that if you ask employees, they will all say, and do you know what? It was fun working there. It was fun working with people there, and the work we were doing actually was fun. What they mean by that is that it was interesting and challenging and meaningful to them. Um, so I absolutely think, I mean, I am Irish after all, and a sense of humor. A sense of humor is an essential thing if you're to survive in Ireland. So absolutely, and I really do think uh, it's very important. There are some nations that are a little bit stiff initially, but once you peel away a few onion layers, you find that they've all got great humor. Right? They just keep it under wraps until they trust you a little bit more. Particularly if they're from countries where dictators uh, are in place. They tend to be a little bit reticent initially about publicly making fun of the politicians. But it comes in time. So yeah, I think it's a real core ingredient. People should be enjoying themselves at work. Why shouldn't they? And if you've
Yeah.
got a good manager who's helping you be successful and you're learning new things, why wouldn't you like that? I think so. Yeah, it's a core part.
Do you think humor could be a litmus test for a company's culture?
It would be a very interesting thing, right? I mean, there's a you have organizations like the Great Place to Work environment. I have looked at their scales. I haven't seen anything about humor in them. And I know there's kind of the Healthy Workplace is another company that I know. And I haven't seen how they're going to measure it. But yeah, I would say, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Do you have fun at work? Do you enjoy what you're doing? Do you enjoy the company of the people you're working with? I mean, personally, I'm extremely fortunate working with the group of people, largely psychologists, in my own university, and young, very energetic, very bright, learn a ton just interacting with them, and a tremendous sense of humor. So yeah, so I do think it's important.
Do you think CEOs should express a sense of humor?
Yes, as appropriate, right? If you if you're the type of CEO who can tell a joke and pull it off, absolutely. If you're the type of CEO who tells jokes and they're like lead balloons, and they just plunk, then maybe take a little bit of training. So I'd say do what's in your nature as much as possible. I do find that a lot of CEOs are very funny people, off stage, and they'll say terrible things, they never say in a public environment, because having a bit of flair and having a bit of being likable, and also having a sense of energy and can do, those are attractive qualities. Humor often goes with that territory as well. But if you can't pull it off, don't fake it. Because it'll be deadly. In fact, I've written a book of jokes during the lockdown with a colleague of mine in the US, Bob Carroll. And Bob's a retired engineer. He's about 80 years of age, from NASA. And some of the best jokes I've heard over the years have been from Bob. And so anyway, we finally teamed up. So we're trying to get it published at the moment. So that's another thing.
I think there's two things that you said there, which I think is interesting. One, people that tell jokes. So if you want to watch something interesting, I think Tim Gard is probably one of the most interesting people I found on as a humorist. He talks about humor and how we use humor at work, and how we can use our different perceptions of the world to find the humor to mitigate some of the harshness we might experience, which I thought was a very interesting way of doing it. But he is extremely funny. The other side is we talked about compassion, we talked about humor. What about vulnerability in leaders? Because you talked about likability. Does that vulnerability feature into
Yes,
that?
And it's a real big theme at the moment. It has been a theme for at least 20 years, but it has really only become a common theme, I would say, in the last 6 or 7. The idea that somehow leaders should express their vulnerability, because that shows their humanity to their followers, and that they can empathize with the people they're leading, and that people will respond in kind to that leadership. And I agree with that. But I also spend a lot of time with executive MBA students, and they're busy telling me about how toxic their cultures are, and how they have terrible leaders, and they have vindictive leaders, and they have Machiavellian politics, So I'm always kind of holding myself back a little from saying, yeah, you should, absolutely open up in that environment, because that's not the environment to do it in. So it's and I would recommend a gradated approach to expressing vulnerability. So say who you are if you're making a speech or talking to people. Let people know who you are. Let them know your values and so on. But don't do it in a context or an environment where you're absolutely going to be filleted for it. And I've known CEOs who have exploited, who have presented themselves as demonstrating vulnerability, only to fillet the people who work with them using the same tool. So a lot of stuff, a lot of stuff goes on, right? So you just need to, it's a very good idea. It does bond people to you. It's tremendous to show empathy, and people do appreciate empathy. But just be careful when you are expressing your vulnerability. How much vulnerability and to who, I think should be taken into account,
I think it's a good point you're making there, that vulnerability is also a choice.
Yes.
It is choosing what you want to be vulnerable about. Yeah. And I would suggest practice the story.
Yeah.
Tell it to people that you trust first.
Yeah.
make sure that you're comfortable with the story and you don't mind sharing it. I think one of the things that brought that home for me is coming out at work was really hard. And so I needed to tell stories that I could weave that in without it being overt or pushy, and get people comfortable without seeing me and not just an orientation, for instance. And I think that helped me. And I think that's also something in leaders. If you pick something that you believe others will see as vulnerability, you can create their narrative around it so that it leaves you less vulnerable at work to people that might exploit it. But at the same time, also have the perception of vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember being in the company of someone who was a lobbyist, business lobbyist on Capitol Hill. I was doing some teaching in the US, and so I went along the first year, and he made this great speech to a group of executives who were, in their late 50s, early 60s, vice presidents, very wealthy people. And they were really there as a kind of a legacy event to kind of reflect and think and talk to other people about similar concerns, And at one point in the speech, he reached up, he talked about his son, he was working on the missions, and he wiped a tear from his eye. And I thought, my God, that's so powerful. Except I was there the next year, okay? And at the same point in the same speech, he reached up, talked about his son and the missions, and wiped the tear from his eye. It's all fake, So you need to be careful.
I think that's one thing with speeches as well. I'm currently president of the Professional Speakers Association in the Netherlands, and so I'll be over in your neck of the woods in September for our international conference. So I'll let you know. The other thing, and one of the things is you as a speaker, you're expected to have practiced. You're expected to have every single timing perfectly sorted in your speech. And it's very difficult to have that done to the point where everything's perfectly timed and perfectly curated and still stay authentic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's hard. I mean, I've listened to people talking about being gang raped, or people in really vulnerable positions where they've suffered tremendous trauma. And I don't know which way is the best. If somebody actually goes back to the emotion and feel the way they feel and express that on stage, or if it's more a clinical description.
Yeah.
Both of them can be quite powerful.
Yeah. I think just applying the filter of honesty to it. If the person is authentic, and if the person is being honest about the emotion, and they're giving the speech more than once, yes. But I think you can tell when someone is just clinical, I remember years ago seeing Samantha Goshel, who's, for me, the best executive educator I ever saw when I worked at London Business School. And I brought him over to Ireland to speak. And, he gave the speech, and, part of it involved, because he worked in INSEAD, it was, reaching up into the spring blossom of the forest in Fontainebleau, plucking some cherry blossom, I mean, my God, it was brilliant, And I saw him later again do it, but it was true, it was true, and it was genuine. So, just to be aware that sometimes people fake.
I'm wondering if it's important if they fake, if the outcome is for the benefit of those they lead.
Yeah, you really get into kind of Aristotelian ethics with that one, So
and the question is also, will people follow you if they believe you're not truthful? So we get back to trust.
Yeah, I think if people will support you if they trust you, and I don't think that in the longer term, if they suspect that you're fake, then you're going to have a big problem.
When we see I mean, you've seen teams under stress, I'm sure,
Mm-hmm.
and you've
Mm-hmm.
looked at the anxiety side of things and even burnout maybe. What do you think are our first symptoms we can look for, and what are the things we should be aware of as leaders and take care of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I was having a discussion about this in the classroom recently. You need to recognize what I would call social withdrawal in the workplace, first of all. People who have normally been quite chatty, who now don't even stop to speak to anybody. People who have used to have a coffee and go for lunch. Now they have withdrawn from all of that, and there are some people who say, well, that's a private matter, and I really don't need to interfere. I don't think that's a good idea, because when you notice subtle and sometimes not so subtle changes in behavior, there's usually something going on. And just a quiet word, how are things, or sitting down, just having a chat. Again, the trust level is important, but you can perhaps get to a situation where the person doesn't enter the full downward spiral of burnout, and you can have an intervention early on, And I had a friend, an academic friend, who told me once about, it's a Scandinavian country, and he told me about a friend of his who had basically become a recluse for about 3 months, I said, do you not, and I was having this conversation in Denver, and I said, do you not think you might check it out and see how he is, So, I couldn't because, the invading his privacy and so on, So anyway, I convinced him to do it, and he did do it. And the only reason I know he did it was because a couple of months later, a certain Scandinavian professor joined me on LinkedIn out of the blue from the same institution, So maybe I was putting two and two together, but my sense was that the intervention had worked. So in submarines, and I've had the good fortune to have two submarine commanders in class with me in two different countries. And one of them, he was a French submarine commander. He told me that in his submarine, they actually do a weekly check on burnout symptoms of the crew, because they're all working very close together, intense working conditions. There's hardly room to swing a cat. And, sometimes they're out there for months and months and months. So they do a weekly burnout check using a questionnaire, and they have an onboard psychologist who gathers the data and analyzes it, and so that he or she can see if there's blips, appearing, and do something about it, So there's certainly some companies right, that they take it very seriously, and I guess if you work in the Navy, that's pretty serious. For me, I was just gobsmacked, something you'd never think of.
Especially if you think about the military or the Navy, it's sort of like it's very gang ho, and there's no or gang ho. There's no. You don't think people think that seriously about mental health. What do you think we can take from that? Is there a questionnaire like that available somewhere that people can
They were
download?
using the Maslach burnout inventory, and that's widely available. It can be administered by non-psychologists. There are other inventories like the DHQ-12, which have to be administered by psychologists and so on. So there are certainly things like that, Again, there is the issue of invasion of privacy, So if I think you'd have to be very upfront with your workforce and say that, we are looking at these things and monitoring them. They would have to trust you. Otherwise, they would say, well, if I let people know how I'm going to be, how I am at the moment, and I'm not in a good place, then I'm going to be fired, then they won't do it, So it's coming back again, I think, to your point, Extine, on trust in the organisation. But it would be a good idea,
I think I've seen a lot of the stuff up close and personal. I mean, I had my own brush with PTSD after the military, or basically at the end of the military, and I know how clawing back from that took years. It took me about 8 years before I felt like I was back
Yeah,
again in
yeah.
an almost normal functioning way, and I learned a lot of the skills and tools to not go there again.
Yeah.
To survive that. And I've also seen that in burnout, and a lot of the people that I
Mm.
coach, leaders that I coach, I sometimes see this sort of early symptoms. I think what has been shocking to me is that people in companies, or basically managers and leaders, don't realize that when you're under duress, your performance
Yeah.
suffers. So all the executive functions. I mean, they know this. We know there's a correlation between that and cortisol. In that, the higher the cortisol, the lower the executive functions. Sort of like emotional outbursts, resistance to emotional impulses, task initiation, creativity. Planning, prioritization. All these kind of things are really important at work. And the more we increase the pressure, the less people can function properly.
Yeah.
And so when they're in the edge of burnout, any increases will just either break them or just rapidly decrease performance. Why do you think people still are in this mode of fear-based management?
That's a really good question. Right. The Amy Edmondson is a professor at Harvard University, has written a book called Fear in Organizations, and it is all about this psychological safety. I think there's a number of things. I think one is kind of the historical evolution of the command and control organization in certainly Western Europe, and the idea historically of a more autocratic style of leadership and management coming from the military and then filtering through into organizations. So there is that residue there. I think the managers who are being trained and prepared to lead now are much more open and much more developed and exposed to things like vulnerability and compassion and so on through their coaching experiences in programs. So I would expect that the problem would be lessened, but there's a big fat bulk of people who are in very senior positions, and they have learned that the way to get to the top is to bully their way to the top, and to present themselves in one way to one audience and another way to another audience, also known as, kiss up and kick down management. And they've been rewarded for it, I remember talking to a friend of mine who's in a very large life assurance business, and he told me about a sales director who was very good at his job and very effective and getting really good results, but he was getting them at the expense of his team and burnout in his team, and he basically was a bully, and he went to the CEO about it, and the CEO left the person in position for another 6 years before he was replaced. Why? Because he was getting the results. So so you do need some auditing mechanism to identify in the organization, because if you did an employee opinion survey or an engagement survey in that organization, you would identify the pockets where there were very low engagement, and it would highlight to you. But it's a level of, I suppose, it's a level of compassionate leadership that you have to have in the organization to be aware of these things, to do something about it. And a lot of the time, it's results first and people very much as second.
I think it's is my opinion.
Yeah,
I'm going to have got any research
that's
to
okay.
back it up, but I think fear-based leadership is for lazy people. If you're not willing to put in the work to
Mm,
connect, if you're not willing to put in the work to make those feel around you that they can be vulnerable, that they are
mm,
safe, it takes work to
mhm,
do that. It doesn't just happen automatically.
mhm.
And I think if you're not willing to put in that work, I think you're
Yeah,
lazy.
that's a really interesting point. The thing I would add to that is that some people who are not capable, right, because they don't, from a kind of an early developmental stage, never experienced what it is to be encouraged or nurtured and so on, that they carry that with them, and a lack of social skills, which then in turn makes them that the way they have to get their way is through bullying at work. And, we all
Mm.
know, right? Right? Bullying does work, in certain circumstances. And that's the sad thing about it.
I think what scares me the most about those kind of environments is the impact it has on young working people. I mean, if between 18 and 25 is sort of your time that you learn about intimacy and
Mm-hmm,
vulnerability
mm-hmm,
and the ability to connect. So even if we teach people that from an MBA or from a business management course or something similar, when they get into the work environment and they have these horrible examples where people treat them really badly, we're actually affecting the organization for not just the rest of the time that those people are there, but those people's
mm-hmm,
lives for the rest of their
mm-hmm.
lives.
Yep, they carry it home, and our family, if you've had a bad day at work, the people in your family, your partner, whatever, they know all about it, because you come in the door, you're grumpy, the dog runs away uh, at the back door before you can kick it. uh, so everybody suffers, and so it's a terrible chain of effects that are put in place by bad leadership and bad management, which is why good leadership and good management really, really matters.
Do you think the KPIs to be measured, which is usually more around performance on a financial scale or hours and things that are easily measured, do you think that plays into us having more sort of psychopathic and sociopathic kind of behavior at
Yeah,
work?
the uh, yes, okay, it's and again, the dark triad of psychopathy and sadism and Machiavellianism, you know, how much of it do you find? 15, 20% probably in a lot of organizations at the top. So, so in a way, we're kind of focusing in on, you know, the really bad organizations right now in our conversations. But there's a very, very old rule in management, which says what gets measured gets done. You know, so if you have a metric and it's only around the results, the financial results, and you're getting the financial results, there are those who say, "Well, what's the issue here?" You know, people come and go. Yeah, they get a bit burned out, but sure, look, it's time for them to move on. We'll just get some other people in. Um, in an organization like that, you'll get that view. Uh, if if you are more sophisticated, then you'll have a company that will have some type of a balanced scorecard. And the balanced scorecard will have financial results. Uh, it will have, or team results, whatever KPIs are there. It will have results about employee satisfaction. Uh, and they might even take into account some form of 360-degree assessment of managers. I always find it funny when when you go in for your performance appraisal and whatever it is that you do once or twice a year, and people are busy asking you, about your goals and so on. Like there's never the question, what do you think of my leadership?
Hmm.
And you're thinking, boy, you have a lot to do with this.
Yes. Do you think that we there should be a KPI we're measuring around mental health?
Yeah, There should be. There should be. Definitely. Definitely. And then you'd need some measurement system in the organization. You could have proxies for it, but like an employee engagement, a good employee engagement probably is highly correlated. Scores probably highly correlated with the mental health of your people as well. Just in terms of having a not an oversensitive measure. So yes, absolutely. But you're looking at really, really good companies, and some exceptional companies do things like that, and take them seriously, and have leaders who, just won't put up for it, bullies down the line.
I think it's if we realize how much performance we're breaking down the line, which I think has people underestimate. I think the one thing, there's a TEDx talk that I like of Margaret Heffernan,
yeah.
And she talks about something called the pecking order. I don't know if you've seen
No, I
that
haven't.
one.
She's very good though.
And she talks about that our performance measurements are comparative to one another, but not comparative to industry. So are we actually creating high-performing teams, or are we creating relatively high-performing individuals, and they're still performing badly if you should put them against any meaningful measurement in the industry? And I wonder if companies realize the impact that they have on the performance of their own people and the output of the company.
That is interesting. I know of one organization in the UK. It's linked up with Aston University. It's called Aston OD. And in Aston OD, they will come in and they'll do climate surveys for you. But because they've been into so many different industries, right, they can actually produce benchmarks for you to let you know how you're doing and how you're performing. So that, I think, might help to answer Margaret Heffernan's question,
Well, Patrick, I would like to thank you for being with us today. It is, I'm really glad you could take the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today. And always having fun.
Absolutely. And likewise, excellent. Thanks a million. And thanks to your listeners too. Thank you.
I've seen it in different organizations. In some places, it is horrible. Absolutely, you wouldn't want to be seen dead there. And people emotionally and psychologically die in these organizations. Places where burnout is commonplace. People can't concentrate, can't focus, can't prioritize. All the things that says cortisol is running like mad through these teams. And I've also seen organizations turn that around. Not just turn it around, I've seen organizations where, no, it's not blissful. Yes, it's still work. It still has to be done. But where the interactions become something that is a source of strength. Place where some teams were only created during COVID, and so they know no other way of interacting but remotely, and yet have found ways and interventions to make those connections really stick. I believe that in no matter how much of a connected and not connecting world we live in, it's possible, very much so, that when we shift our perspective, we can make a huge difference as leaders, and we can make not just a difference in the lives of those we work with, but those that they spend most of their time with outside of work. I believe we can make people see the beauty and the wonder of working with each other. What do you think? Now go out there, be exponential, and do something nice for someone else. You can find us on the web by going to podcast.exponentially.me. We will also find additional media resources and some amazing insights.